Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to November Stock and Flock Talk. I'm Dr. Carrie Rood, Extension Veterinarian with the Animal Dairy Veterinary Science Department here at Utah State University. Thank you for joining our Stock and Flock either in person or via recording. And these recordings can be found on our Extension website. If you just search for animal health, you'll be able to find the pre-recorded presentations, previously recorded presentations, as well as this one. So I'm happy and pleased to have Kim Chapman with us. He's an extension professor located there in the central portion of the state. Kim and I have done a lot of things over the years, and I'm excited to have him talk about some of the historical data that they've sort of mined from the Utah Beef Improvement Association bull test. So Kim, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah, you're gonna have to speak up just a little bit, Kim. There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds good. All right. We'll get going. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today and to be able to talk a little bit about the UBIA bull test and some of the information we've been able to glean from all of our years of participating with the association. I'm frozen up here. Okay, there we go. All right, just to give you a little background information, our involvement began back in 1972 when the association was organized by a group of forward-thinking seed stock producers here in the state, and we've been involved with them throughout the years at varying levels. I currently serve as the executive secretary for the association and the technical advisor for the test. And so, but that, I mean, our participation has really been across the board. In the early years, my office actually would make a potluck lunch on sale day and offer it to all those that came to the sale at the end of the test each year. So it's been a good association between Extension and the association throughout the years. UBIA partners with commercial feeders to accomplish the test. Over the course of that nearly 50 years, we've been at 3 different feedlots, one in Centerfield, one here in Sevier County in Aurora at Johnson's feedlot, and currently the test is being conducted at what was formerly Kennison feedlot, now Cedar Ridge Farms. And those are great associations to be able to, and partnerships to be able to work with. We follow the guidelines that are set forth by the Beef Improvement Federation for central tests, and it is a forage-based test that we participate in. From 1987 to 2019, we've tested over 7,700 bulls. The information I have before 1987 is a little has a lot of holes in it, and so I just have good data from 87 on. 3,000 of those bulls have been sold into commercial and seed stock herds throughout the Intermountain region, all the way from coastal Oregon clear to parts of Colorado, New Mexico. So we do have a pretty broad range. The last few years, we have been selling some bulls on video, and so that's helped to broaden the reach of the association. And really, the objective of the test is to assist our both commercial and seed stock producers to obtain genetically superior performance tested bulls that are structurally and reproductively sound. So we really put a lot of emphasis on making sure that these bulls, once they leave the test and go out into the herds, are ready to work. So I'm going to talk about two different studies that Dr. Garcia and I have worked on over the last couple years. The first is a performance study looking at the historical data from 2004 to 2018. You might ask, well, why haven't I gone back to 87? None of the data prior to about 2004 was complete data, or it wasn't digitized. And so we elected to start at 04 and go through 2018. We looked at birth weight, adjusted 205-day weight, which basically is the weaning weight that has been adjusted to a 205-day standard. It also factors in the age of the cow and the milk production of the cow, and that helps give us a good kind of the gold standard in the beef industry. We looked at initial weight coming onto test, final weight at the end of the test, average daily gain while on test, and then we also looked at the adjusted 365-day weight, which factors in post-weaning performance, and finally weight per day of age at the end of the test. We, as we went through, this test is unlike other tests around the country, is open to any legitimate breed, and so we have many breeds represented throughout this data set, but in order to really get any meaningful statistics on them, we elected to look at only those breeds that had 500 head represented over the study period. And so that means we looked at Black Angus, Red Angus, Hereford, and Simmentals. So getting into the results, we across the board, the breeds did not show any significant differences relative to birth weight or the adjusted 205-day weights. Now, we did see change in all of those, in both of those traits, but basically it was a decrease in birth weight and an increase in weaning weight or the adjusted 205. However, relative to the initial weight coming on to test, average daily gain while on test, finished weight, yearling weight, or the adjusted 365-day weight, and the weight per day of age, we did see significant differences in those traits. So if we look at those traits, we see that there's some kind of general things that we can look at as we look across this table. One being we generally saw a decrease in weight. across all the different parameters that we were looking at. And I think part of this is probably a result of the seed stock producers recognizing that there are, their customers, who are the commercial producers primarily, have very limited resources out on range. And so if you get animals, if you have bulls coming in that are too large, require too many groceries, their calves and subsequently any replacement heifers that are kept out of them are going to have problems relative to maintaining body weight on those limited resources. And so I think as we look at these numbers, we can see that the seed stock producers are cognizant of that and have bred accordingly to try and moderate overall body size relative to the bulls that they're producing. If we look at some of the individual categories, and again, differing superscripts indicate that there are statistical differences. We see with all three of the weight categories, in weight, final weight, and yearling weight, some fairly significant decreases or rates of change throughout the study period. Generally, it's interesting that the Simmental didn't show as much change relative to the other breeds as I would have maybe thought we would see. Generally we think of the continental breeds as being the ones that pack on the weight and the size. And again, I think we're seeing some significant effort on the part of our Simmental producers to moderate those body sizes. We see that in most of the categories, the Simmentals are pretty much similar or have no significant differences in rate of change relative to the others. But within the English breeds, we are seeing some significant difference, especially with the in weight. We see larger decreases in weights amongst the two Angus breeds relative to the Herefords, which I think the Herefords have traditionally lagged a little as far as body size and what have you. They've tried to stay more the traditional body type, I guess, if you want to call it that. And so they actually were playing a little catch up, coming in to with a little larger sized bulls relative to the other two English breeds. Some of the other things to point out, the final weight and the adjusted yearling weight, those kind of correlate pretty closely, since that final weight is a lot of the post-weaning performance of these calves is exhibited in those final weights, and the yearling adjusted yearling weights mirror that change there that we see in the other breeds. Not a lot of change in average daily gain. If you factor that in over that extended period of time, we're seeing some decrease, but it's not a huge amount relative to averages. So are there any questions that I might not have covered with any of these results?
Kim, I'm not seeing any from the chat.
Okay, great.
Well, Carol, can I ask a quick question?
Dr.
This is
Wong.
Zhongdou Wang here from ADVS. I probably among the all the audience the least familiar with the cattle, but I'm just curious. So I was surprised to see that the breeding program has been leading to a direction that produce seem to be a dwarf cattle. So if you have the bulls become smaller, would the calves be smaller too? Sorry for the naive question.
Yes, that's really kind of what we would estimate would happen is as they have reduced the size of the bulls over this extended period of time, we would anticipate that the frame scores of their calves would be somewhat smaller. However, if you look at the expected progeny differences of the bulls coming out of the test, many of them have excellent numbers relative to weaning weight and yearling weight, which indicates that even though they may be smaller framed, they are still going to be able to exhibit the high performance that we've seen of their sires on test. So it is not going to impact the general performance of the calves relative to post-weaning performance in feedlots, etc. Or the even though we didn't look at carcass quality, the carcass traits that these bulls exhibit are still very much within industry parameters as being acceptable.
Thank you. So the numbers are in pounds, right, or kilos?
These are in pounds.
In pounds.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the second part, the second study that Matt and I have worked on, and this is relative to PAP scores. PAP standing for pulmonary arterial pressure, and you might say, well, why is that important? Well, elevated PAP PAP is basically the blood pressure of the animal, and elevated PAP can lead to what we traditionally have called brisket disease or high altitude disease. It's a disease that was first identified in the early 1900s up in northern Colorado in the high altitude areas in northern Colorado, and that's always been kind of traditionally what we've thought of PAP being. However, in the last few years, we've started seeing what the veterinary profession has termed right heart failure in low altitude cattle, even cattle down to say 2,000 feet elevation in feedlots. And a lot of this RHF problem that we're seeing is in cattle within the last month of the feeding cycle. They're just about ready to go to market. They start exhibiting these symptoms and tip over and are dead. And so it's becoming a very critical thing, not only for those producers that run at high altitudes, which we have traditionally thought, but also in the feedlot industry. Clinical signs of RHF, initially it looks like pneumonia. Maybe not with as snotty a nose, but they're lethargic. They lack energy. They go off feed. And so we think, okay, well, they're going off feed. They may or may not have a fever, but we're going to go ahead and treat them as though they were getting pneumonia. Well, as the problem is because it's actually RHF, we don't get the bang for our buck on treatment. And so it progresses. They develop edema down in the brisket area and subsequently die. Dr. Heaton at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center at Clay Center has provided these images for us. You can see the edema down here in the brisket area. As it advances, the edema can actually advance up in the neck region and even into the lower jaw in just prior to death. And when we start seeing this edema form, we know we've got problems with that calf. If you look over here, this is a normal heart. It looks like a normal heart. If you look at a cross section, good muscle formation there. Everything looks good on this side. This is an effective heart, and you'll notice the extended size, and especially on the right ventricle, because the heart is having to pump so much more and work so much harder, we start seeing this enlarged heart. The walls of the heart become thinned, and we start losing function of the heart, and subsequently we see this problem forming. On this study, our data set was smaller. This issue, especially at the feedlot level, did not start rearing its ugly head until the mid 2000s, 2006, 2007. And so we began in 2008 collecting PAP scores on a voluntary basis of those bulls that had qualified for the sale. The previous study we discussed was all the bulls on test. This data set is just those bulls that were going into the UBIA sale at the end of the test. They were the highest performing bulls. And so the numbers were quite a bit smaller. And subsequently, we decided anything with at least 100 head represented during the study period, we would use those breeds. It just works out that that happened to be the same 4 breeds as the previous study. If we look at the least square means and compare those amongst these 4 breeds, you'll see, and these are in the scale for this is help me out, Carrie.
It's pressure, and so I think it's mercury.
Yes.
It's not bars. Yeah, it's something mercury, right?
Yeah.
It's a pressure.
It's a pressure measure anyway. I apologize for not having that right at the forefront of my mind right now, but you know, as we compare and look at these at these 4 breeds, you would think that the Angus are kind of driving what's occurring, and to a certain extent that's true. However, you can see that again, the Simmentals relative to
sorry, it's millimeters of mercury.
Millimeters of mercury.
HG.
That's thank you. I appreciate that, Carrie. But you can see that there's really no statistical difference between the Simmentals and Herefords or Red Angus, but there is a difference between the Angus and the Simmentals and the other 2 English breeds. And this is, again, the average PAP score over the entire period in the study. If we do a regression slope on that, we come up with a slope of 0.81, which shows that, you know, over this basically 12-year period, we've increased PAP scores on average close to 10 points, and that becomes significant. If we go back to this, you know, one thing that I might should explain here is if we're looking at a score on a bull, we want it to be around not higher than about 44 at the elevation that we're testing, which is 5,300 feet. There's a kind of misperception that in order to have any validity, these tests have to be conducted at 6,500 feet or higher elevation. However, the experts that over at CSU, Dr. Holt, who has been kind of the guru of PAP scores, says that even down to 5,000 feet, PAP testing can be a screening test down to about 5,000 feet. Below that, it doesn't have much meaning. So at the 5,300 foot elevation, it is a good screening test. For those that run at high altitudes, those customers, we recommend that they take the bulls up to elevation, acclimate them for 3 weeks and retest them. with the guarantee that we will stand behind the bull. If it tests too high, they will get their money back and or be able to select another bull. So as we look at these PAP scores on average, these all still look pretty good. However, with a 39.23, you may have bulls in, and we've seen them that have scores higher than 50. And at our elevation, we would recommend that they not be used as high altitude in high altitude situations. But anyway, that's kind of how the scores are read. And you can see there were a couple years here when we had some really elevated scores and on average, and that was very concerning because our producers have really tried to be very tried to put some selection pressure to keep those down. One thing that we do see in the seed stock industry is we don't see a lot of bulls that are in the AI catalogs that are produced at high elevations. And so that may be factoring in to why we're seeing some of these elevations. If we break out and look at the each breed, I think the one thing that really comes out is the Red Angus are significantly higher than any other breed relative to their rate of change. And so where we thought, well, it was probably the Angus that were driving that slope, come to find out a lot of that was coming from the Red Angus in the test. And in fairness, most of the Red Angus seed stock industry is at an elevation below 3,000 feet. And so it's hard to find bulls that are produced at elevation that you can actually get some good data on.